Good afternoon from Berlin, where I'm based.
Hello.
I still hear Mozart, but I will continue anyway. Again, good afternoon from Berlin. My name is Ekrem Edigüzeldere. I'm a research fellow in the Turkey program of ELIAMEP and today's moderator. I had to close the live video, otherwise I hear myself a second time with a time delay. So we will have a panel with 3 experts. They are based in London, Ankara and Strasbourg on various aspects of the ongoing confrontation between Turkey and France, and hopefully also on how the current situation could be de-escalated. We will start this seminar with the panelists who have roughly 10 minutes each for their initial presentations, so that in total this should not last much longer than 30 minutes, and we can use the rest of the time for questions and comments and a discussion with the participants. If you do have questions or comments, you can use either the Facebook or the YouTube page where this will be live streamed, and write your questions there, then they will be forwarded to us. So if you are watching it from the ELIAMEP homepage, please, if you have questions, switch to one of the social media channels to be able to write questions. This is a public debate, so there are no Chatham House that do apply. In the program, the speakers are listed alphabetically. We will start, however, with Güney Yıldız, followed by Zana, Çıtak, and Samim Akgönül for, let's say, dramaturgical reasons. Güney Yıldız is a journalist and researcher who's usually based in London. He focuses on radicalization and Turkey, the Kurdish issue, and the broader Middle East. Alongside the IPC-Stiftung Fellowship at the SWP, he is also a journalist with the BBC and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC. On the issue of today's webinar, he recently published a so-called point of view for the SWP entitled Turkish-French Culture War over Islamist Radicalism and Islamophobia May Unite Europe Against Turkey. This bilateral harsh confrontation is rather new. Less than 3 years ago, Daily Sabah titled an editorial, Emerging Turkish-French Partnership. This is, so to say, old-style screen sharing. This is from January 2018, and the article says that Turkish President Erdogan's visit to France established that under Mr. Macron, France could replace the United States as Turkey's strategic partner in the Middle East and elsewhere. That did not quite turn out to be the case. For the why, you have roughly 10 minutes, Güney, to enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekrem, for your introduction, and good afternoon to everyone from London. France and Turkey have been confronting each other to different degrees in 3 continents. The tension began to simmer in Syria, exacerbated in Libya, and the latest episode was in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But nowhere the crisis could get as serious as East Mediterranean. And the ongoing tension over culture, political Islam, as you mentioned, or Islamophobia, has so far united Europe more than the hard geopolitical power struggles that I mentioned. I'll divide this brief talk into 3 parts to discuss 3 questions mainly. The first question is why Turkey and France are in different camps on multiple foreign policy files, and why France is almost leading the de facto doctrine of containing Turkey. And the second question will be why France, a UN Security Council member, a leading EU country, a powerful nuclear and conventional military power, and a very large economy, fared so badly in its competition with Turkey in Middle East and North Africa. So comparing the 2. And the third question will be whether President Erdogan is right to think that France will eventually abandon Greece and Cyprus in the face of sustained military and political pressure from Turkey. So the first question, France is not the only Western country Turkey has problems with. And we can compile a very long list of problems Turkey had with its other allies. But why France is one of the strongest proponents of containing Turkey policy in the West? So it is due to 3 factors. The first one is a unique combination of economic, political, and even ideological clash between the two countries. So there's a clash of commercial interests between the two in Eastern Mediterranean and in Libya over energy resources. And in Libya and Syria, there are ideological and political reasons as well. Paris and Ankara have been supporting opposing actors and have very divergent views on the role of political Islam and in the future of the Middle East. And their views on radical Muslim armed non-state actors is very different. France is prioritizing this issue as a security threat very highly. If you've read, for example, President Macron's interview just 2 days ago, he mentions one of the two main events of 2020. One of them is the COVID pandemic, and the other one, he says, is what he refers to as Islamic terrorism. So in order to deal with this problem, France looks for partners that they can work with, such as President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, and in recent past, General Khalifa Haftar in Libya. And but Turkey, on the other hand, is trying to position itself as the leading defender of Muslims worldwide. Ankara's, symbolically at least, rhetorically, Ankara's policy is not to lead Sunni Muslims against Iran, but to have influence across the Islamic world by playing into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the tension between Muslims and the West. And Ankara is also increasing its reliance on armed proxies centered in Syria, but potentially deployable elsewhere. The second reason for the tension, the level of intense tension, is that both countries are pursuing more active and indeed activist policies, foreign policies. France wants to assert itself as a superpower in the Middle East. And very recently we've seen this became more visible with President Macron's visits to Lebanon, and previously in Syria, for example, while many Western states were staying away from the conflict or staying away to get militarily very heavily involved in the conflict, France had the second most important Western military presence on the ground, and that is actually where I think the problem started between Turkey and France. And Turkey is also following a proactive, interventionist, militaristic foreign policy, and this policy has been in preparation for some time. And Ankara sees it as forward defense, basically. There's also the path dependency as the third factor. So when you have one crisis combined with another one, so if there was only one of those crises present, like if the only tension was Eastern Mediterranean, I think the situation will be much less tense. But if you combine it with the situation in Libya, Syria, and now in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as this symbolic cultural war between the two countries, then the situation becomes even worse. And people also talk about personal aspects, like the personalized conflict between President Erdogan and President Macron. But that, I think, aspect of the issue won't take us far, so I'd like to leave that aside. The second question I want to deal with is why France, a UN Security Council member and a powerful country, is faring really badly in its competition with Turkey. And I think I can mention 4 reasons. The first reason is their successes in finding allies. France couldn't get the EU or the US behind its policies in Syria. I mean, President Macron tried very intensely, personally, to change, for example, President Trump's policies in Syria, but that didn't work. France also couldn't get the EU. There was a strong division between Italy, France, and other European countries in Libya. And also in Eastern Mediterranean, France has so far failed to persuade other European actors for its more harsher responses to Turkish activities in Eastern Mediterranean, and also in Nagorno-Karabakh. But on the other hand, Turkey was able to establish a working model with Russia on almost all of these files, more so in Syria, Libya, and Nagorno-Karabakh than in Eastern Mediterranean, obviously. The second reason is despite France is way much more powerful than Turkey militarily, economically, and diplomatically, Turkey is the political situation, domestic political situation in Turkey, lets President Erdogan to take much more risks than President Macron. President Erdogan is more secure politically, or has been more secure politically than President Macron in France, and this is not just necessarily due to the popularity of these presidents, but also to do with the media structure, the way the media ownership works in Turkey, separation of powers, and linkage of economic and political power, which also works to the benefit of President Erdogan. And this risk-taking capabilities, I think, was very laid bare openly in Idlib, when Russian-supported Syrian troops inflicted heavy casualties on Turkish military, like dozens of Turkish soldiers were killed in Idlib. I can't imagine any European country. I can't imagine that there won't be any furor in any European country if such a thing happened in any of those anywhere in Europe. But President Erdogan was very successfully, comparatively, compared to the severity of the event, the incident, prevented any kind of public backlash on this. The third reason is the state formation. I mean, there are some similarities between the two states. I mean, both states are run by executive presidency, and there's a high level of centralization of foreign policy, both in the Elysee Palace and presidential complex in Turkey, at the expense of foreign ministers. So there's this centralization. But the Turkish state and the Turkish establishment is much better organized and unified, I think, around pursuing these policies in Syria, Libya, Eastern Mediterranean, and elsewhere. So the policies in Libya, Eastern Mediterranean, or these other issues are not just President Erdogan's policies. President Erdogan is not necessarily the most hardliner figure in some of these files, including probably Eastern Mediterranean. It is like in the broader Turkish establishment that there's the consensus on these policies, which also helps Turkish policymaking processes. And the fourth reason is there's the holistic approach and creative compartmentalization that Turkey employs, as opposed to a fragmented, usually an isolated view of foreign policy files in the West. So when Turkey looks at Libya file, for example, they consider it as the part of same doctrine with Syria, their activities in or support for Azerbaijan or Eastern Mediterranean, and also they see these different foreign policy files as linked to each other in their cooperation or coordination with Russia. Whereas the West see, I think, generally each of these theaters of war as separate from each other. They don't necessarily have a holistic approach to put leverage on one issue in order to gain something on another. So we don't see necessarily that kind of creative approach. There's also, President Erdogan implements a very successful compartmentalization policy as well with regard to Iran and with regard to Russia. Despite being in conflict in so many issues, those conflicts are compartmentalized, and there is also a working relationship with Russia. And finally, the third question, whether President Erdogan is right to think France will ultimately abandon Greece and Cyprus in the face of sustained military and political pressure from Turkey. I believe he's generally a very good reader of international politics, but I think he might be, this issue could prove him wrong. I'm referring to his statement earlier this year. Because there are various reasons. First one is for France to abandon Greece will mean abandoning in practice the idea and doctrine of European strategic autonomy. So it's not what is at stake in Eastern Mediterranean is not just the energy resources or French influence in the region, but also about French, how France sees itself, and also wants to see European Union. So if Greece and Cyprus is militarily challenged while European Union is standing by, then it won't be possible to talk about European strategic autonomy anymore, I believe. Second reason is that confronting Turkey, diplomatically at least, in Eastern Mediterranean, it could be more easy for France than confronting Turkey in Libya or Syria or elsewhere, where you also have other actors, and France doesn't necessarily have a fully legitimate presence. I mean, in Libya, we know the official French policy has been full support for the GNA, the Tripoli-based government, but also we know in practice French special forces were embedded or helping the LNA, the Benghazi-based forces of Khalifa Haftar. And also, another reason is that in Syria, in Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, the Turkish success was in most part due to Turkey's cooperation with Russia, but that is much less the case, much less of an issue in Eastern Mediterranean. So that's another reason why France might, stand by in the region. And also, of course, there's the change in White House could affect all of these policies, because the US until now hasn't been involved concretely in this in the issue of Eastern Mediterranean, and we may be actually seeing some early indications of that change with the ongoing foreign visit by US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to France, where in a joint statement they clarified that they spent a lot of time to discuss what they call Turkey's aggressive policies. And also Pompeo visited Turkey without seeing President Erdogan, without visiting Ankara. Of course, Greece, if push comes to shove and there's increased tension in the region, Greece will need to fight its own corner before waiting help from others. But Turkey already sees Greece as a proxy actor, not necessarily the main rival in the region. They believe, especially some in the military, believe they're confronting a much wider bloc, and Greece is just a proxy actor in this fight. I'd like to conclude here, and I hope my remarks were provocative enough to start some debate.
Thank you very much. I do think so. We'll continue with Zana Çıtak, who is Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations at Ankara's Middle East Technical University. Her research focuses on nationalism, state-religion relations, Islam in Europe, and gender. Since you are, among the panelists, the only one that is currently permanently based in Turkey, I would like to ask you to elaborate on what Erdogan is getting out of this confrontation domestically, and how this conflict is perceived among different stakeholders in Turkey, and maybe also on what this bilateral confrontation could mean for the broader Turkey-EU relations. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ekrem, for this introduction and for the organization of this panel, and for having invited me. Yes, since I'm based in Ankara, I have the responsibility to talk to you about, the domestic politics in Turkey and how this crisis in French-Turkish relations interact with Turkish domestic politics. In that sense, in fact, we have to follow a major argument that has been in place pretty much since the beginning of Erdogan's coming to power in 2002. Basically for the last 18 years, but more so probably in the last decade or so. That is, with the start of an increasing authoritarianism, authoritarian tendencies first, but today we can talk about, a more or less consolidated, authoritarianism in Turkey. Basically, there has been a general argument that never had domestic politics so much intermingled with foreign policy and vice versa. That is, there has been so much, in fact, interaction and interpenetration between foreign policy and domestic politics, something pretty much unprecedented, in fact, in modern Turkish or recent Turkish history, in fact. So I do agree that all these, in fact, crises that, in fact, Güney, Yıldız talked about in a very elaborate way, crisis in Libya, in Eastern Mediterranean, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Turkish-French confrontation through and over, those cases, they help Erdogan to make this basically claim that, in fact, the whole world is against us. As soon as we start to speak, they're trying to silence us, but we are a major power in our region. We are a great power, and we will never be driven back to our previous place. In his own conception, basically a more passive sort of like Turkey, just because somebody said so, just because the French said so. So in that sense, I think there's a great deal of manipulation of foreign policy for domestic purposes. And in that sense, we can talk about, this claim to be a great power, not just even a regional power, but a great power. And to have a place at the table of the great powers is not just a claim for an important claim, a traditional claim for Macron, but also it has been increasingly a claim for Erdogan and for Erdogan's regime. And it has a lot of, in fact, appeal in Turkish public opinion. A lot of people who might not have heard of many things that have been going on in terms of domestic policies, in terms of different laws that pass at the parliament. They are aware of the Turkish foreign policy's activist stance abroad. And this has a lot to do, of course, with the very severe limits to the press in Turkey, to the media. So the Erdogan regime is capable of, in fact, giving an outlet only to the news that it likes, and the mainstream media likes to, in fact, talk about, especially those particular incidents in Turkish foreign policy. But of course, it's not just for domestic politics, and there are also geopolitical interest in all these, incidents in these different cases that Yıldız talked about. However, I would argue that, and this will be probably, the point that I want to make today. These are, yes, geopolitical crises, which have also some domestic appeal as well, given this interaction between domestic politics and foreign policy in Erdogan's regime. But at the same time, beyond path dependency, which I believe do exist for the other crises, this latest crisis over the caricatures, between Macron and Erdogan, and the reciprocal accusations and the new Charlie Hebdo caricature about Erdogan, right? All of these, I think, this latest crisis, which I would not call a cultural crisis, in fact, or a cultural confrontation, this is not path dependent. I will argue that even if none of the other crises had happened or were in place, such as the issue over Eastern Mediterranean, or Syria, or Libya, or Armenia-Azerbaijan confrontation, I believe that there would have still been a crisis in this latest incident about the caricatures. I think that we lose sight of basically how there are two different mentalities on the part of Erdogan on the one hand, and Macron on the other hand, and all the French leaders, in fact, French presidents and French statesmen in general. And there have been arguments as to how, in fact, domestic politics were more important in shaping that crisis in the case of both Macron and Erdogan. That is, for Macron, the coming 2022 elections, presidential elections, and his attempt to sort of prevent the far right to, to outbid him, to have the elections, to win the elections. And so basically taking a tougher stance against the radical Islamists and so on. And in the case of Erdogan, this perception that in fact the economic crisis, and the depreciation of the Turkish lira against both US currency and the European currency has been a major factor in sort of like trying to create another crisis and having this sense of unity behind Erdogan so that, the economic crisis would be forgotten. So it was seen as a strategy on the part of both leaders to divert attention for Erdogan, in the case of Erdogan, from the economic crisis, and in the case of Macron, to look tough. I believe that even beyond that, right, there's another reason, in fact, and I think even if there were no elections in France in 2022, or even if there was no economic crisis in Turkey, there would still have been a crisis over the caricatures. And so this brings us to somehow to the limits of thinking of domestic politics as the most important variable in shaping relations between France and Turkey. Because I believe that, in fact, there are two important factors in this crisis that we really need to understand. In fact, in 2005, when there was no economic crisis in Turkey, and Turkey was, in fact, in a period of prosperity, and Erdogan had his story sort of like at its peak in terms of how he was democratic and how he was going to bring prosperity and democracy to Turkey. Even at that time, in 2005, there were, in fact, suburban riots in France, not only in Paris, but also in several cities. And we can remember that, in fact, at that time, Erdogan again, accused France of Islamophobia and talked about how, because of the headscarf law that had just passed, in fact, only a few months ago in 2004 by President Jacques Chirac, he said that, in fact, the reason why France was, in fact, was witnessing all these riots, suburban riots, it was because of what it was doing to its Muslims, right? It was as if, the suburban riots were related to Islam, which was not the case. I mean, there have been again and again, a lot of studies on those riots, and obviously youth of immigrant origin were involved, and obviously of Muslim origin were involved, but never was the issue of headscarf even raised, during those riots. But Erdogan wanted to frame the issue, the suburban riots, as if it was to do with France's treatment of its Muslims and France's Islamophobia and the headscarf ban. So, in other words, I think, even at the peak of his power, even, when everybody was supporting Erdogan, both at home and abroad, right? He did not refrain from criticizing France over, the question of Islam and accusing France of Islamophobia. So in that sense, I think, we see the clash of, in fact, two things. On the one hand, I think, this has a lot to do with Erdogan's dislike, to put it rather, modestly, of the understanding of freedom of expression in France. So from Erdogan's perspective, and speaking on behalf of the Muslim world, because he has a claim to speak on behalf of the whole Islamic world as its spokesperson, in fact, this could not be called as freedom of expression, but rather a hostility towards Islam, and a way for Macron to basically to fight Islam. So there are two, in that sense, opposing mentalities. I think, secondly, another clash happens because French leaders and France as a whole takes itself as the representative of the universal values since the French Revolution. It has a missionary attitude in that sense. Erdogan doesn't have a universalist stance, but he thinks he does. He wants to speak on behalf of the Muslim world, and these two, one universalism and the other one partial universalism, but rather in fact particularism, because it's only about the Islamic world, although sometimes he tries to sort of like tailor it as people who are oppressed, right? He's speaking on behalf of the people who are oppressed, but nevertheless, he usually means the Muslim world. Basically, this is two types of basically spokesmanship clashing in that sense. So, so beyond path dependency, I believe, we are at a stage in French-Turkish relations where, in fact, we see the clash of two different stances, two different mentalities, one of Erdogan regime and the other one of France in general, and French leaders, basically, in recent French history. So let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much. Then before we go to the discussion, let's turn to the third speaker, who is already heavily multitasking, as we see, Samim Akgönül, who is, according to Turkish Wikipedia, he's a French academic, historian, political scientist, and author of Turkish origin. So you have to cover, let's say, so the French element in this panel too. He is currently the director of the Department of Turkish Studies at the University of Strasbourg. His research focuses on religious minorities in Turkey and the Balkans, and also Muslim minorities in Europe. His latest book publication in French is La Turquie Nouvelle et les Franco-Turcs, une interdépendance complexe, which was published this year. I would like you, therefore, to elaborate a bit on this complex interdependency, as you called it. And as you said in a blog last week, Erdogan is now trying to go down the European path, and the French suburbs are a perfect example, and present himself as the new caliph, the true defender of Muslims in Europe. President Macron, therefore, becomes a perfect enemy, the persecutor of Muslims. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ekrem. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. Just a few points. I will be very, very short, very quick. Then maybe we'll have a discussion and I will be able to answer to some questions. Just to introduce my thoughts, we have to say that if there is a tension between France and Turkey, I think the structural reason is the fact that France and Turkey are very similar. They have similar structures. They took examples from each other. Turkey has the example of the Third French Republic in all its institutions, and with the presidentialization of the regime, with the new regime, it is more similar to France. Sometimes we say that there is no checks and balances in Turkey. This is true. I mean, checks and balances institutions are behind the president, but the institutions are still there. And these institutions are copies of the French institutions. But in another way, for example, the will of France of creating a French Islam that is accused by President Erdogan, saying that how you can reform Islam, how we can create a French Islam, is actually exactly what Turkey did. So France is taking the example of Turkey to create this Islam controlled by the state, behaving nationally, territorialized, and a domestic Islam. So this is exactly what Turkey did since 1920 and 24, and still today, maybe. So in that case, these are two sisters, very similar sisters, and they are fighting each other on several points that my previous colleagues explained. In this current situation, current discussion, current struggle between France and Turkey, we have to see these 2 points of view. The first one is the President Macron's point of view. President Macron is facing several crises in France, internally several crises. Of course, pandemia. This is the crisis for the entire world, the economic crisis, which is related to pandemia, but not only, but also the difficulty in France to reform the state. because of the power of the civil society. Just before the pandemic, there were some very important resistance from the French civil society to reform the retirement project, for example, the retirement system, for example, the educational system, for example, etc., etc. Remember, please, the yellow jackets just before the pandemic. So, on the one hand, Macron is facing several internal crises. On the other hand, there is a huge, important crisis, which is the terrorist acts, Islamist terrorist acts in France, cutting the head. People in Turkey must understand the huge symbol of seeing for French people in the streets of Paris, in the suburbs of Paris, of a teacher that the head cut off. This is huge. This is very, very important. It made a huge shock. So Macron had to answer very quickly and very radically to these acts. And there were some other acts, and he said we will continue to make caricatures. So Erdogan took it, transformed it, and he understood we will continue to make caricatures of Mohammed, which wasn't exactly what Macron said, but we can understand. So Macron had to understand. And as Zana said, in 2022, there will be second elections for Macron, presidential elections, and he is thinking to the second round of second elections in front of Marine Le Pen, who is the leader of the far right in France, at the television during the debate, explaining what he did against the Islamist terrorism in France. So he had to find some solutions. In the Erdogan's point of view, of course, as my previous colleagues explained, the internal policy being much more important than the external policy, manipulated for the internal policy. All these are true. But I think that after 2011, Erdogan wanted, as we know well, everyone wanted to become to win the Arab street. So the idea was that in all these countries, Ikhwan, the Muslim brothers, will be successful. There will be Muslim brothers governments in Tunisia, in Libya, not in Libya, in Egypt, and in Syria, and Erdogan will be their leader. It's a failure. Wasn't the case. So Erdogan sees that he lost the Arab street. But there is another street, the Paris suburb street, which can be won. So today I think that it's much easier to play on these streets, Paris suburb streets, Berlin suburb streets, less Berlin than Paris. Paris is not so easy than Berlin, but Paris suburb streets. So he's playing to become this new caliph. And we have to add that in these streets, there is a need, there is a will. It's maybe easier to be the leader of these streets. These Muslims, born, raised, educated, socialized in France, not only in France, but especially in France, but also in the Netherlands, in Belgium, sometimes in Austria, in Germany, and less in the Great Britain. They are in search of a leader, in search of a person who could speak against the governments of the countries where they live. And they don't like these governments. They don't like these regimes. They think that these majorities humiliates them. So yes, Erdogan can win. And my last point is the fact that in this tension between Turkey and France, there is at the same time an actor and a victim. The actors and victims are people originating from Turkey living in France. We have to look always to minorities. When there is a problem between Turkey and Armenia, my first idea goes to the Armenians of Turkey. So when there is a problem between France and Turkey, my first thought goes to Turks in France and French people in Turkey, maybe at least French institutions in Turkey. There are approximately 500,000 people living in France related somehow to Turkey. Somehow. They are immigrants, for some of them, a minority. For majority, they are born, raised, educated, socialized in France, but they kept this sentimental link to Turkey. They are divided, like Turkey. 20% of them approximately are from Kurdish origin, 20% of them approximately are from Alevi religion, and there is a very important class issue. That's why maybe at the same time AKP and HDP, Kurdish party, Kurdish Democratic Party, and the AKP receives more votes in France than in Turkey. Approximately 65% for Erdogan in France, 50% in Turkey, approximately 20% for Selahattin Demirtas during the last elections, double in Turkey. So as you can see, it's a very divided community, but it's a very dynamic community. It's a dynamic community controlled, framed by Turkey by using a very strong ideological apparatus of the state. Diyanet, imams, and teachers are actors of this framing and controlling, to repeat, to receive, and to repeat the state's discourse, the Turkish state's discourse, and the majority does this. So they are reinterpreting this discourse, adapting to France, and using this discourse that Turkey wants. There is an important political involvement of Turkey in France. Grey wolves, as we saw, it was the less important. So the MHP party, but also Milli Görüş and DİTİB, Milli Görüş as political Islam and DİTİB as political Islam, but state political Islam, are very strong in France. And even if there are some rivalries between these organizations, in some questions, in some points, they can be united and having this Turkish state discourse, and thinking to Armenian question, it's a recurrent question in the French-Turkish relationships. Of course, the caricatures, of course, the ban of headscarves, Islamophobia, etc. For these kind of problems, these kind of issues, they can act and they can speak together. They are very, very well controlled and very, very well framed by the Turkish state's apparatus. So in that case, Macron sees also that the tension between France and Turkey has an impact in the internal policy of France, which is directly related to the Turks' impact. But on the other hand, there are several thousands of Turks in France, people originating from Turkey in France, who have nothing to do with this tension, who are suffering because of one, tension between France and Islam. They're Muslims, they see themselves as Muslims. Second, from tensions between France and Turkey, because they are Turks and they are suffering. And unfortunately, they can become very easily victims of discriminations against, of hate speech, etc., etc. So this is, I think, in the middle term, short term and middle term, very, very dangerous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samim. Thank you to all the three speakers. We have now a bit more than half an hour for the discussion. I will check from time to time my email whether I get the questions via Facebook or YouTube. As long as this is not the case, I would ask you the one or other question and invite you also to discuss among yourselves. Maybe I'll start in the chronology also of the panel with a question to Güney to specify maybe some elements or to broaden the debate a bit. I mean, some start this clash actually a little bit earlier, that this has also to do with Turkey being much more active in Africa, that Istanbul became the hub for traveling to Africa with Turkish Airlines and no longer Paris. Turkey becoming a donor in many African countries, where France, as the former colonial power, was for a long time the dominating foreign or European power. Is that also part of the story still, or is it now more focused on the East Med and clashes that you talked about?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call the rivalry between France, the economic rivalry between France and Turkey in Libya, necessarily highly confrontational at that time, because they're all also competing with other actors, like including China and others. And Turkey has been operating in some areas like Somalia, for example, where other European countries cannot have necessarily. I mean, Turkey can play as a entry points for those kind of debates. So it's when Turkey and France compete, it doesn't necessarily mean it's necessarily a clash. Syria was, I think, a good example. From 2011 onwards, I think France was one of the leading European countries who pushed for military intervention in Syria. Also, they've organized the first ever so-called Friends of Syria meeting in Egypt, for example. And then Turkey became more significant in that issue, but they shared the common goal of toppling Assad for a long time. It was only after 2015 that the militant extremist groups came to dominate the French policy in Syria, as well as anti-Assad policies. And for that, France cooperated with the US to partner with a Kurdish-led military alliance, a multi-ethnic military alliance. From that point onwards, I think we see that the rivalry turns into, kind of started simmering into becoming a clash. So, but then when there's this tension, then every other rivalry adds to the tension. So previously, more, let's say, peaceful or a relationship of both rivalry and cooperation turns into an issue of tension. For example, let's say in Lebanon, you can argue that there are some common points that where France and Turkey could cooperate on, but not. I don't think that is necessarily the case with the existing tension between the two countries. Due to that, any French move in Lebanon would be seen probably more hostile by Turkey, and vice versa. And we've seen, for example, how President Macron's visit to Lebanon was covered by pro-government media in Turkey, which wasn't positive.
Thank you. Then maybe I didn't get any feedback so far. So then maybe also a question to Zana. I mean, Samim said that you have to understand this great symbolism that a French teacher in the suburbs of Paris was beheaded. Now, from outside of Turkey, it seemed that about this there was little perception in the media in Turkey. What happened that triggered the French reaction? Could you elaborate a little bit on that situation and how different parties or stakeholders see this in Turkey? That as a justified reaction to the cartoons, the beheading, or is it just ignored because of the media power that the government has and controlling most of the media, and or how you see that?
Mm-hmm. And that's a very good question, in fact. Obviously, there's a government-controlled media, so people are not really aware of what really happens. But there's another side to the issue. I think, the opposition in Turkey is also on the defensive when it comes to Islam, when it comes to Islamophobia. They feel like they have to support the government, Erdogan, whenever, it's a question about, Islam issues abroad. So foreign policy in that sense is a very fragile issue, and something where, in fact, the opposition feels the need to at least look like they're supporting a national cause. And Erdogan, because Erdogan frames and calls everyone as a traitor if you do not support his discourse, his foreign policy, then in fact you're in trouble. And I think the opposition takes this defensive, rather apologetic stand for Erdogan, and they don't talk about the beheading, obviously, and they rather say, well, of course, caricatures are an insult to Islam, and Islamophobia should end. So I think it's not just the government-controlled media which doesn't necessarily talk about this particular incident, which is horrible, in fact, right? And I agree with Samim Akgönül that people in Turkey do not grasp not just the symbolism, but the severity, gravity of what happened, the beheading of a school teacher, right? But at the same time, it's because of the trap in which the opposition finds itself whenever, either a national, what is considered as a national cause, or Islam are on the agenda. So I think, there's very little understanding of the trauma that the French people experienced in this horrible murder of Samuel Paty. And this is precisely the reason why, in fact, Erdogan could just, pass without having, presented his condolences to Macron. And this has been, Samim knows it, I'm sure, better, but there has been, in fact, a lot of mentioning of this in the French media, right? That Erdogan did not even, present his condolences. So an all-out sort of, accusations followed, the moment that the caricatures were reflected on the municipality buildings in 2 other cities, in Toulouse and Montpellier. So only after another beheading, 3 beheading incidents in Nice by a radical Islamist, that Erdogan finally presented his condolences and showed some sympathy for what the French are going through.
Because it was
as a trauma.
Zana, because it was in a church. So for Erdogan, the fact that it was in a church, which is a worship place, is much more symbolic and important. So he can present his condolences than in the streets. So because it was very, and it was perceived like this, such as in France, he presented his condolences because it was in a church. It was very interesting to see this difference of attitude. Sorry.
You're right. I mean, because one of the things that Erdogan had mentioned, in fact, was that how comes they can close down a mosque in Ponta? Was it Ponta? Soon after, in fact, the beheading of this high school teacher. A mosque was closed down for having, in fact, distributed videos basically condemning this high school teacher for having shown in his class, the caricatures. So he said, how comes that you can do that, closing down churches, mosques? Are we doing this in our country? We have so many churches and synagogues and, open, and people can, freely worship, in those places. So this correspondence that he established immediately was important.
Churches. Empty churches and empty synagogues. Right?
Yes, I mean, we're talking about 2,500 mosques, around 2,500 mosques in France, whereas we talk about how many churches and, non-Muslim worship places in Turkey, and how many of them are, in fact, open for worship. That's another matter. But, this correspondence across, in fact, the worship places, I agree with Samim, is relevant to that. But what I'm saying is, when he presented his condolences, it was in fact news, right? Whereas it shouldn't have been news normally in a more, normal relationship, right? Because of the gravity of the incident.
So actually, I have now 2 questions, but before getting to them, I would also, on this perception in France, to ask something to Samim. I am from Germany, from Munich, and I live in Berlin. The biggest immigrant groups are people from Turkey, be they Turks or Kurds, and through TV, through visits, Turkish politics is very present, and Erdogan appeals to a large portion of this immigrant community because it's the same religion, it's the same language, it's the presence. But in France, that is a bit different. The biggest immigrant group are not Turks. So how come that they are not looking for an Algerian or Tunisian or Moroccan or another Arab leader that they can appeal to, where they share the same language and upbringing and family roots, and that then, let's say, so outsider gets into that position that they cannot understand in the language that he's approaching them.
Thank you, Ekrem. First, we have to understand, all of us, that 90% of people that we perceive as immigrants, immigrant communities you mentioned, 90% of persons that we perceive as immigrants never migrated, never. They are maybe the less mobile fringe of the society. Mobility is a class issue. They are born, raised, educated, socialized in Berlin, in Munich, in Strasbourg, in Paris. They are freed consequences of these Western countries. They are not coming from elsewhere. They are the children of these countries, first thing. Second thing, how come that it's not the case for Algeria, for Tunisia? Somehow it is. Somehow Algerians, Tunisians, and more of that, Moroccans, because of the kingdom and the symbolism of the king of Morocco, are related to the originated country. They are watching the TVs, they are framed and controlled, especially for Morocco. But we may say that for the last, well, not 10 maybe 7 years, the dynamism, the activism, the entrism, this is the vocabulary of Trotskyism, the entrism of Erdogan, of Diyanet, of Turkey in a general manner is much more active than the other countries. So it is more visible. When Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, or even Senegal maybe, are applying a kind of control and intervention for the communities originating for these countries, it's not visible, it is somehow legitimated. For the Turkish case, not only it is not legitimate, there is a time factor. Secondly, there is a colonialism factor. These countries were colonies of France, so the French-speaker countries. And thirdly, it's very, very active. It's very, very dynamic. It's disturbing to see how in all fringe of the society, in all fringe of these of the institutions, Turkey wants to enter, to infiltrate, to to play a role. This is why I think it's more visible than the others.
Thank you. So now I will ask these two questions that we got through the chat. I don't know who asked the questions, so I will put them out, and then whoever wants to answer is free to do so. So the first question is more on the international EU dimension of the confrontation. What is the opinion of the speakers about the different behavior of Germany and France to Turkey? How does Turkey profit from that? Any volunteer on that, or how is maybe also Germany's kind of mediating role helping Turkey or dividing the EU? And should Germany, who is a member of the EU, not side with the other EU members like Greece and Cyprus in this confrontation? Yes, Güney?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I think Turkey benefits strongly from the divisions in the EU, but those divisions, the primary division is between France and Germany at the moment when it comes to Turkey, and that the most concrete aspect of the how Turkey benefits is that kind of division prevented harsher economic sanctions towards Turkey in the latest European Commission meetings, and we don't know, but maybe in the future ones as well. But France is not just have a different opinion or different approach to Turkey than Germany, but also until recently it had with Italy as well, with regard to these geopolitical confrontations, because Italy invested both in Libya and also in Eastern Mediterranean. And yes, Turkish attitude or Turkish policies in Eastern Mediterranean could be a cause for concern for Eni, the Italian energy company. But Italian investments in Libya could do well with, not alienating Turkey. I mean, without alienating Turkey, they could be in a better position. That might have started to change with Turkey gaining an upper hand in the conflict, coming to dominate basically the Libyan theater, especially the Tripoli government, which I think sent some shockwaves to the Italians, thinking that if Turkey dominates, then their energy interest could come into danger. And it's interesting that this political process in Libya started only a couple of weeks after Turkish officials announced deals that are going to be made between Turkey and the Tripoli government on energy. So that could push Italy towards a little bit closer to France, and that could be a very significant development. Another country, France had problems or have a different opinion on Turkey was the UK. Obviously, when it comes to Turkey, UK has very different kind of relationship with Turkey than France. But since the UK is leaving the European Union, and then the balance of forces inside the Union between UK, France, and Germany will shift probably to France, Germany, and Italy. And that's why I think that a shift in Italian policy could be very significant, which hasn't yet happened. The third division is between the US and France, also on Turkey. The US administration itself is divided on Turkey, with White House under Trump administration, very close to Turkey on some levels, with State Department, I think, mostly agreeing with Turkey on most foreign policy files, but with Pentagon, with strong divisions, divergence between Pentagon and the Turkish policies. So in that sense, since the European Union is not necessarily a union when it comes to specific foreign policies, Turkey benefits hugely from this. And President Erdogan's, the way he wants to conduct foreign policy is not necessarily between institutions. So he doesn't necessarily want to deal with the EU as an institution, but he wants to deal with individual countries. And when it comes to individual countries, he wants to deal with it leader to leader rather than institutions of each country. So in that sense, as long as there's no strong unity in Europe, then Turkey will continue to benefit from this.
I mean, Germany was in 2017 was like the bad guy for Turkey, especially ahead of the referendum, and now it has this shift to being seen more as an honest ally. So can we then hope Please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. What I wanted to say about that is, we need to differentiate between rhetoric or what I call noise and the substance. So in terms of rhetoric, between leader to leader, or in the media, or in either country's parliaments, if you read German papers and Turkish papers, you would think these two countries are in some sort of a Cold War at least. But if you look at the state-to-state relations, we have quite a different picture. We always had quite a different picture. I think there is a strong continuity in that sense from early on until now. So I don't see necessarily a shift in German policy towards Turkey or shift in Turkish policy towards Germany. There were frictions and mostly transactionalist frictions, but Germany never acted strongly against or never pushed for any strong and there were lots of opportunities for Berlin to take on, and there were many voices in Bundestag that make that point, hold an anti-Turkish rhetoric, but that never, I think, became state policy. That's what my understanding.
Maybe Zana, if you want to also, how Germany is now seen in Turkey. In this
I was just going to, I agree with Güney, but I was just going to add that in fact, it seems like Macron is redefining, in a way, France's position within the EU. He has several times declared in the past how he's critical of NATO in the first place, and how NATO was brain dead, right? And that there was a need for a wake-up call for NATO, and that was in response to Turkey's policy in Syria. Macron believes that the UN Security Council is not working. It is unable to find solutions. So in general, like in the several interviews that he has given recently, you can see his disappointment with the existing international frameworks, especially in the absence of the United States. So there's a certain vacuum, in fact, left by the withdrawal of the United States administration under Trump. So all these criticisms vis-à-vis the United States, vis-à-vis UN Security Council, vis-à-vis NATO, leaves Europe as the only alternative, in fact, for as a platform of cooperation and as a tool for France to speak even, with more power in the world. This has been, in fact, pretty much the traditional French foreign policy vis-à-vis Europe since Charles de Gaulle, right? Basically defining the French great power status, something that will be realized through Europe, right? So France will only be a great power if it is within the EU, well, within Europe in that sense. But today, I think, Macron really feels that France alone cannot fill, the vacuum, and France alone cannot create, international cooperative frameworks. So Europe would be the one, in fact, to create those frameworks, such as, on climate change and on energy, on many fronts. So I believe that that's why he's underlining the European unity even more, and constantly underlining France's solidarity with Greece, and with Cyprus, saying that they are, in fact, the members of the EU, right? More so than, in fact, underlining this unity more than, in fact, Angela Merkel.
Yes, Samim, please.
Just a few words. I have some difficult conditions, so my interviews are very, very, very short. We are talking about a period, 4 years period, where United States of America were absent from the international politics. Maybe President Trump will receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He withdrew all the U.S. Army from everywhere. So the foreign policy of the U.S. was very, very passive for foreign policy. Now, in the following 4 years, with Joe Biden, things will be probably very, very different. So the France's role, France's activism to change the international system, the Turkey's role in the Middle East, but also in the Balkans and in Caucasus, will change, will reposition it when the United States will be present again in all these areas. And again, for the same thing for NATO. I agree with Zana. President Macron is very, very critical with NATO. It was its traditional policy from France. Charles de Gaulle also withdrew France from NATO's executive power, but Nicolas Sarkozy took it back, and maybe Macron wants to do the same thing, but during the second term it will be the same thing. For the moment, he wants to reform NATO, but again, it's a NATO where US is absent. We will see in the 4 following years when the US policy will be completely different.
Thank you. Now there are also more questions coming in, and even with names who are posing them. So I will ask another one. It comes from Emre Metin Bilginer, is a PhD in international relations. Can you please express your remarks on the influential impact of Le Pen regarding French-Turkish relations? I think this goes to Samim.
Very shortly. Marine Le Pen, after her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, tried to take the Front National from the far right to the center. Actually, he succeeded somehow. In all presidential elections now, traditionally, she, and before her, he, so her father, was the second candidate. So I think that it is in passive, in negative, one of the main actors of the French internal policy and French external policy. But again, in France, institutions are so strong, the checks and balances are so strong that Güney said that at the beginning, the Turkish policy in the Middle East was more coherent, unified than the French ones. Well, it's true, because in France, there is a kind of checks and balances, and people, institutions speak differently. And at the end, there is a policy which is found. In France, also, the far right dictates the policy, but at the same time, this dictation of policy has some limits. So we can take as a main actor of the French policy without exaggerating her role.
Thank you. Then there is a question by Demetrios Zounis. I hope to pronounce this more or less correctly. How the above-mentioned politics or postures influence Greece and generally the Greece-Turkey latent conflict? How do these politics, to translate this, how do these politics influence Greece and the Greece-Turkey relations, let's call it this way?
You mean the French-Turkish tensions, how they influence Greece?
This is how I would read it.
Well, maybe France showed itself as the main protector of Greece and Cyprus in Eastern Mediterranean, so maybe there have been some influence, but in somehow the Greek-Turkish relations have the regular pattern, the regular balance, and the regular tensions and friendships. So I think that they are independent from the French-Turkish relationship, but maybe Zana and Güney can explain better than me.
I will let Güney to answer that. I'm certainly not very knowledgeable in Greek-Turkish relations, but I would say that, the fact that, friends came to the help of the Greeks in this particular Eastern Mediterranean question doesn't necessarily prove that there's a connection between the two. In fact, pretty much Turkish-Greek relations have been, to a certain controlled manner for a very long time, problematic anyways. So let me just say that.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a difficult question, really. But let me try a provocative view. I don't necessarily see like European Union or France playing a very positive role in bringing Greece and Turkey together for a variety of reasons, including it affects the perception of it causes a wrong perception of the balance of power in the region. For example, we've seen in the early weeks and months of this tension in Eastern Mediterranean that Greek government was pushing for a aggressive or nationalistic policy or rhetoric against Turkey. So almost like matching the Turkish aggressive policies in rhetoric. But then probably they were counting on stronger support from Turkey. But then we've seen when Turkey increased the tension, increased the stakes, then Greece had to back down. So I think that was due to a miscalculation of the who will do what, or whether European Union will come to the rescue of Turkey. I mean, Greece and Turkey has strong diplomatic links. Like they don't necessarily need other powers to mediate between them. I mean, we're not talking about the let's say Assad regime or Turkey, that you need an external mediator. But even with them, we know that they're talking to each other. So I think in that sense, like, I think we need to also mention that the Greek, as I agree with Professor Çıtak, like these two countries had tense relationships for decades already. And those tense relationship will not go away because of other because of, let's say, dialogue, or it's not like we shouldn't anthropomorphize these relations. I mean, there was this talk about earthquake diplomacy in 1998, 1999, for example, bringing countries together. I mean, we recently had another earthquake, in which we saw leaders expressing condolences or sympathies on Twitter or talking to each other. We didn't necessarily see any kind of rapprochement after that. We need to, I think, locate the rapprochement between the two countries in 1999 firmly based on other concrete changes in the relationship. And I can mention several issues to that. And the tension between Turkey and Greece will not necessarily be resolved when you have like full EU backing militarily Greece against Turkey. It will, I think the weak point are to weaken the more hardliners on each side. What needs to be brought to table is a political resolution to this issue. So concessions from both sides. That will happen diplomatically anyway at some point, whatever France does, I think, because Turkey is preparing to talk to Greece, but the question is when and under what conditions. So when Turkey establishes a fait accompli on the ground, like create a de facto situation, and then negotiate from that position of strength. So that is when Turkey achieves that position, then they will come to talk. The second is under what conditions Turkey wants its military presence felt during the negotiations. So I think any kind of negotiation or any external actor approaching this issue with the intention of reducing the tension should take these into consideration.
Since Güney already started talking about how to de-escalate and talk again to one another, I wanted to use the last roughly 10 minutes on how the Turkey-France relations could be de-escalated, what needed to happen, who could help to bring the two sides closer together, and how do you see the evolvement of bilateral relations in the coming months?
Well, it will de-escalate, of course. As we can see, it is at the same time, it has some structural reasons, but also some very punctual, chronological reasons. I think that in short term, it will de-escalate because Turkey needs, President Erdogan needs crisis and short crises. So it can't be a long crisis with France anyway. It's not possible. As you mentioned, in 2017, Germany was the bad guy. Today, it's the good guy. In 2020, France is the bad guy. Maybe in 2023, it will be the good guy. And it was the case during the entire last 15 years, let's say, not 20, but 15 years, it was the case. Russia is once the bad guy and then the good guy. Greece is the good guy and bad guy, and Germany, and so on and so on. So it will de-escalate. But there can be some several facts that can help and accelerate this de-escalation. On the one hand, Macron can explain himself the French position better in the Islamic world, that it's not the disrespect of Islam or anything, but the blasphemy right. The right of blasphemy is one of the founding values of France, but the Muhammad or Islam are not the target. The main target. The main target is Pope, actually. The main target of all these caricatures is the Catholic Pope. So, of course, this explanation, he tried to do that. He sent his Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Al-Khazar in Egypt. He gave an interview to Al Jazeera. He tried to explain this position. It wasn't successful until then, so it can be. And on the other hand, Erdogan will find another enemy, certainly, in order to fight, and he will forget Macron. And maybe Macron won't be re-elected or won't be a candidate in 2 years, and so it will be forgotten.
Any other views on how to de-escalate and how to bring the two again together?
I can say a couple of words, in fact, on that. I agree that, in fact, for Erdogan, everything can be forgettable, right? As long as, a particular crisis serves the purpose, you can forget about a series of crises. This has happened with the United States. This has happened with Germany, and certainly, it can happen with France. Although I would still say that, if, something related to Islam again happens, Erdogan will still find it useful. And not only useful, it's his worldview as well. This is, the frame of his mind. He's going to again, show similar reactions and put Islam on the table and accuse the other side without really understanding, the substance of the question of Islamophobia. This is quite a, pragmatic approach on the one hand, but at the same time, it also reflects the worldview of Erdogan and his understanding of, or his hostility to the freedom of expression in that sense, to blasphemy. But in relation to other questions, such as the Eastern Mediterranean question, I think, others should step in and just like they did with the European Council summit on the 1st of October, in fact, just recently, instead of applying sanctions to Turkey, they should really invite all actors, especially Turkey and Greece, to come to the table. And obviously, on the question of Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey has an important case. In terms of continental shelf and so on, in terms of exploration of gas. So basically, Germany and other actors in the EU, they should create a platform of dialogue, in fact, for Turkey and Greece to talk, instead of excluding Turkey and accusing Turkey of every time pursuing a unilateral, policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Libya is a more complicated issue, obviously, because there's a civil war and there's a UN-backed, UN-recognized government, but then, there's another government which is ruling on the majority of the country. So that's a much more complicated issue. But already in the question of Nagorno-Karabakh, in fact, France has been sidelined, and Turkey, even though it might not have gotten the role it had wanted for itself, right? Certainly, Russia dominated the conflict and the solution to the conflict as well. Nevertheless, in fact, France is not on the table, but Turkey is, and this might maybe push Macron to have a much more cautious attitude in his tackling of certain problems. But certainly, dialogue is important, and obviously elections would come, and Erdogan is seemingly making some moves towards at least, a little bit moving away from authoritarianism and irrational economic policies. We don't know. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but maybe that might also have some influence on his anti-Western discourse as well.
Thank you. Then, Güney, you have the last words.
Yeah, the escalation between France and Turkey we're talking about, not the Greece and Turkey. I understand. Yeah. So I think it will be best to start with understanding why Turkey, at least rhetorically as well as on other respects, target France. I mean, what main reason I think is that Turkey finds France an easy target. I don't necessarily explain this with genuine concerns about Islamophobia in France. The reason is that I think the Turkish government picks its battles selectively. If there was a universal campaign against Islamophobia, I think you cannot escape from targeting the Chinese government for the activities in against Turkish origin Uyghurs, Muslims, and you cannot necessarily escape the previous remarks by President Trump against Muslims. So we didn't necessarily see a strong campaign against these two figures, two countries during those times, which tells us that this is not necessarily just purely concern about Islamophobia. So there are other reasons. I mean, one thing that is different in this last cultural, or what I call cultural, but it's really difficult to describe. I agree with Professor Çıtak on that. In this recent tension is that Turkey thinks it is targeting France only, targeting President Macron personally, but actually this tension in Europe affects Europe broadly. So when there is, radicalization on the streets of Paris, it doesn't necessarily stop there. It becomes a European-wide issue because Muslims and Muslim migrants or Muslim minorities and the host countries are, the problem is very similar. You have that in Denmark, potentially in Germany, in other places. So whatever you do on this subject affects Europe broadly. There's also the security aspect. And for that, I want to say, you can voice, let's say, legitimate grievances of Muslims across Europe, but those who have a more coherent and powerful message are usually the radical groups on these issues. So when you provide a platform for these issues to be debated, then a radical group can tap into that and hijack the agenda. And that brings me to to Turkish potential, probable Turkish policy on appealing to the Arab street or the streets of the Paris banlieues, suburban Paris. I think that is not a very may not be a very wise policy, because appealing to radicalized groups is very dangerous, because they are not necessarily the same as what we call silent majority. They are much more politically active, aware, and they will hold you to your message. For example, if I remember talking to many Syrian activists, mostly Islamist, political Islamists, who became very critical of the Turkish position, because when they saw Turkey didn't follow up on their words or their rhetoric lately. Secondly, when you appeal to these streets, you alienate their governments. I mean, a Jordanian government probably wouldn't want a Turkish leader to be influential on their population. Same goes with in France. So I think Turkey coming to terms with the issues around this debate about political Islam or Islamophobia could help de-escalating the tension. And I kind of believe that the Turkish government became aware of the problem. I think they're backing down slowly. That this is a European-wide problem, and it created a unity among European countries, even more than hard geopolitical issues that we've discussed earlier.
Thank you very much, and also for ending on a slightly optimistic note, the three of you. I thank you for your contributions and for the discussion, and also for the few participants who sent their questions and comments. At ELIAMEP, I would like to in particular thank Yanis Grigoriadis, the head of the Turkey program, Mariana Vassilopoulou, who is responsible for the events, and Alexia Mitsikostas from the Turkey program for their logistical and organizational support. I invite you all to have a look at the website from time to time of the Turkey program, especially, where you'll find the events, publications, and media intervention of the persons connected to the program. There will be another webinar soon on what the new US administration means for Turkey. I think the date is not yet fixed, but it's probably in early December. To end with a note related to the place where I am, about 3-4 kilometers from the theater where Bertolt Brecht used to work most of the time, the Berliner Ensemble Rechte wrote in the play Der gute Mensch von Sezuan, which is kind of the good person of Sezuan. Ourselves dismayed, we stand concerned in vain. The curtains drawn, all questions remain. I hope that at least some of the questions we could answer, and we're successful in finding answers to some of them. Kalinihta Potoverilino, and I hope to see some of you soon in another webinar. Take care. Good night.
Thank you.